June 26, 1942 marked the beginning of a transformation that would haunt the skies above the Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare stood on the deck of the USS Lexington, watching smoke trails disappear into the horizon where Japanese Zeros had retreated. His Wildcat had fought valiantly, but he knew the truth that kept him awake at night. American carrier fighters were outmatched. In the cramped engineering offices of Grumman Aircraft Corporation back in Bethpage, New York, a team led by chief designer Leroy Grumman was already racing against time to create something the Japanese would learn to fear. The Pacific War had exposed a brutal reality. The Mitsubishi A6M0, flown by Japan's elite naval aviators, dominated the early engagements with its superior maneuverability and range. American pilots in their F4F Wildcats fought with courage that bordered on desperation. But courage alone couldn't overcome the Zero's technical advantages. Every engagement cost American lives, and the strategic situation grew more dire with each passing month. Grumman's engineers worked through endless nights, reviewing combat reports from the front lines. According to documentation from the National Naval Aviation Museum, they studied every engagement, every maneuver, every advantage the Zero possessed. The team knew they couldn't simply improve the Wildcat, they needed to design an entirely new aircraft built on lessons written in blood across Pacific skies. Speed, armor, firepower, and survivability became the sacred pillars of their design philosophy. The Japanese High Command remained confident in their aerial superiority throughout 1942 and into early 1943. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Third Fleet, believed the Zero would maintain dominance indefinitely. Japanese training programs produced pilots of exceptional skill, men who had honed their craft over China and throughout Southeast Asia. These aviators possessed an almost spiritual connection to their aircraft, and the Zero's legendary agility made them feel invincible. But beneath the surface of Japanese confidence, cracks were beginning to form. Veteran pilots like Saburo Sakai had encountered the Wildcat's defensive tactics. The Thatch Weaven recognized American adaptability. The tactic, developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, used coordinated defensive maneuvers to compensate for the Wildcat's inferior turning ability. It was a glimpse of American tactical innovation. But what troubled thoughtful Japanese commanders was the knowledge that American industrial capacity was just beginning to awaken. In Bethpage, the prototype was taking shape. The F6F represented everything Grumman had learned, transformed into mettle and determination. The design prioritized pilot survival with armor plating around the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks, and bulletproof glass. 650 caliber Browning machine guns would deliver devastating firepower. The Pratt & Whitney R2-800 double wasp engine promised speed that could match or exceed the Zero. Every specification was written with one purpose: to reverse the tide of aerial combat. By spring of 1943, the first production models rolled off the assembly line. Pilots transitioning from Wildcats marveled at the Hellcat's substantial feel. It was heavier, more powerful, and possessed an unmistakable aura of lethality. Test pilots reported exceptional stability during gunnery runs, forgiving handling characteristics, and the kind of rugged construction that meant pilots might actually survive being shot. The aircraft wasn't trying to outturn the Zero, it was designed to dominate through superior speed, firepower, and protection. August 31st, 1943 would be remembered as the day the Pacific War's aerial balance began its irreversible shift. The USS Essex and USS Yorktown, America's newest fleet carriers, launched their aircraft toward Marcus Island. Among the formations climbing into the tropical morning were squadrons of F6F Hellcats flying their first combat mission. Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare, brother of the fallen Butch O'Hare, led one such squadron. His hands gripped the Hellcat's controls with a mixture of anticipation and the weight of family legacy. The Japanese garrison on Marcus Island scrambled their interceptor Zeros that had defended the outpost successfully for months. The pilots were confident, experienced men who had faced Wildcats before and knew the patterns of American attacks. They climbed to intercept, expecting another grinding engagement where superior maneuverability would eventually prevail. What they encountered instead shattered assumptions that had held firm since Pearl Harbor. O'Hare pushed his throttle forward, and the Hellcat responded with power that would have been unimaginable in a Wildcat. The engine's roar filled the cockpit as he accelerated toward the Japanese formation. The Zeros attempted their traditional tactic, a climbing turn that would force American fighters to either break off or stall trying to follow. O'Hare didn't follow. Instead, he used the Hellcat's superior speed to extend away, gaining energy before swooping back for a high-speed gunnery pass. The .650 caliber machine guns opened fire with a sound like tearing canvas amplified 1,000 times. Tracers reached across the sky, and the Zero in O'Hare's sights staggered as rounds punched through its unarmored fuselage. The Japanese pilot attempted to evade, throwing his nimble fighter into a violent barrel roll, but the Hellcat's stability made tracking easier than it had ever been in a Wildcat. The Zero's wing folded, and the aircraft tumbled toward the ocean below. Around Marcus Island, similar engagements played out with shocking results. Japanese pilots who attempted to engage Hellcats in turning fights found American pilots refusing the bait. The new American tactical doctrine emphasized energy fighting using superior speed and dive performance to dictate engagement terms. When Zeros tried to escape, Hellcats ran them down. When Zeros tried to attack, Hellcats absorbed hits that would have destroyed Wildcats and kept fighting. Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Tanaka survived the engagement over Marcus Island, nursing his bullet-riddled Zero back to a forward airfield. His after-action report to his squadron commander carried an unfamiliar tone, concern bordering on alarm. The new American fighter possessed capabilities that fundamentally changed combat dynamics. It was faster, more heavily armed, and seemingly invulnerable to the kind of damage that crippled Zeros. His commander read the report with growing unease before forwarding it up the chain of command. Throughout September and October of 1943, Hellcats began appearing throughout the Pacific theater. Each engagement provided more data, more kills, and more evidence that American aviation had achieved a breakthrough. The kill ratio numbers told a story that Japanese intelligence officers struggled to accept. Where Wildcats had achieved roughly 1-to-1 exchange rates against Zeros, Hellcats were destroying Japanese aircraft at ratios approaching 10-to-1 in favorable circumstances. The psychological impact rippled through Japanese naval aviation. Veteran pilots who had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor now approached engagements with American carrier groups, with calculation replacing confidence. They developed recognition protocols identifying the Hellcat's distinctive profile at maximum range and reporting its presence to their commanders. The aircraft's name spread through Japanese squadrons, spoken with the kind of respect usually reserved for natural disasters. June 19, 1944 dawned over the Philippine Sea with an ominous beauty that belied the carnage about to unfold. The Imperial Japanese Navy had assembled its most powerful carrier strike force since Midway, 9 aircraft carriers bearing over 400 aircraft toward the American invasion fleet off Saipan. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded Operation Ago. With confidence born from necessity, Japan had to stop the American advance or face strategic collapse. His pilots had trained for this decisive battle, but many were young men with barely 200 hours of flight time, rushed through abbreviated training programs that couldn't replace the veteran aviators lost in 2 years of grinding attrition. Aboard the American carriers, Commander David McCampbell stood in the ready room of Air Group 15 on USS Essex, briefing his pilots for what intelligence suggested would be the largest carrier battle of the war. The walls were covered with maps showing Japanese fleet positions and approach vectors. McCampbell, who would become the Navy's top ace, studied his squadron young men and a handful of veterans, all seated in front of their F6F Hellcats armed and ready on the flight deck above. The weight of the moment pressed on everyone present. The Japanese strike launched at dawn, wave after wave of aircraft climbing from their carriers and forming up for the attack. Zeros, Judys, Jills, and Vals filled the sky in a formation that represented Japan's last major carrier aviation reserve. The pilots, despite their limited experience, flew with determination. Many had been told this would be the battle that decided the war. They approached their mission knowing they might not return, but believing their sacrifice would matter. At a height 100 hours, American radar operators aboard the fleet's picket destroyers detected the incoming raid. The scope images showed a massive formation, and alarm bells rang throughout the task force. Admiral Mark Mitcher ordered fighters launched immediately, and across 15 American carriers, Hellcats roared down flight decks into the tropical morning. 350 fighters climbed to intercept, with F6F pilots checking their guns and scanning the horizon for the enemy they knew was coming. The interception occurred 40 miles from the fleet at 25,000 feet. Commander McCampbell led his division into the Japanese formation with textbook precision. The engagement that followed would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, though the men fighting it that day knew nothing of turkey shoots. They knew only the desperate intensity of aerial combat where split-second decisions meant life or death. The Hellcats tore into the Japanese formation with devastating effect. The combination of superior aircraft performance, better trained pilots, and tactical doctrine designed to maximize the F6F's strengths created a one-sided slaughter. Japanese pilots attempted to break through to attack the fleet, but Hellcats intercepted them in waves. The new American pilots demonstrated competency that Japanese trainees simply couldn't match, a reflection of training programs that had been refined continuously since 1942. Petty Officer Zenji Abe fought his Zero through the chaos, attempting to protect a formation of Judy Dave bombers pushing toward the American carriers. He watched in horror as Hellcats swept through the bombers like wolves through sheep. His wingman disappeared in a flash of flame. His squadron leader's aircraft shed pieces as 50 caliber rounds shredded its control surfaces. Abe's own Zero took hits, and he felt the aircraft shudder. With half his squadron destroyed and the bombers scattered, he made the agonizing decision to withdraw, knowing he was abandoning the mission and possibly his honor, but understanding that death without purpose served no one. By day's end, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost over 300 aircraft, and 2 carriers sunk by American submarines during the battle. The Americans lost fewer than 30 aircraft. The kill ratio exceeded 10-1, with Hellcat pilots accounting for the vast majority of Japanese losses. Commander McCampbell personally shot down 7 aircraft that day, and throughout the fleet, pilots returned with gun cameras full of evidence of Japanese destruction. September 24, 1944 found Commander David McCampbell leading a fighter sweep over Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, where American forces were preparing for General Douglas MacArthur's dramatic return to the islands. The morning briefing had identified a large concentration of Japanese aircraft at Clark Field, and McCampbell's mission was to clear the skies before bomber strikes arrived. He led 7 F6F Hellcats toward the target, knowing the Japanese would scramble every available aircraft to defend the strategic base. As his formation approached Clark Field, McCampbell spotted the enemy over 60 Japanese aircraft taking off and forming up. His radio crackled with the voices of his pilots noting the impossible odds. 9 American fighters against 60 Japanese aircraft represented the kind of tactical nightmare that would have spelled disaster in 1942. But this was 1944, and the F6F Hellcat had transformed tactical calculations throughout the Pacific. McCampbell assessed the situation with the cold calculation that separated aces from casualties. The Japanese formation was disorganized, still assembling after takeoff. His Hellcats held the advantage of altitude and the element of surprise. Most critically, he flew the finest carrier fighter in the world, and his pilots had been trained in tactics specifically designed to exploit its capabilities. He made his decision in seconds, calling the engagement and leading his division into the attack. The opening pass shattered the Japanese formation before they fully registered the threat. McCampbell's guns tracked a Zero through a brief deflection shot, and the enemy fighter exploded as incendiary rounds found its fuel tank. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, destroyed another. The 7 Hellcats slashed through the formation, then used superior speed to extend beyond the range of return fire, climbing back to altitude for another pass. It was energy fighting at its finest: hit fast, hit hard, and never allow the enemy to force a turning engagement. For over an hour, McCampbell and his pilots executed attack after attack. The Japanese pilots, many of them replacement aviators with limited training, struggled to coordinate effective responses. Every time they formed up, the Hellcats struck from a different angle, using altitude and speed to dictate engagement terms. The F6F's rugged construction allowed American pilots to absorb hits that would have been fatal in lighter aircraft, while Japanese Zeros and Oscars fell to pieces under the hammering of 50 caliber guns. Mick Campbell's tactical genius shone through the engagement. He recognized that his ammunition was limited each. Hellcat carried approximately 2,400 rounds total across 6 guns, which sounds like a lot until you're fighting continuously for an hour. He ordered his pilots to make every burst count, firing only when they had high-probability shots. The discipline paid dividends as Japanese aircraft continued falling from the sky. By the time Mick Campbell's guns finally ran dry, he had personally destroyed 9 aircraft in a single mission, a record that stands among the greatest individual achievements in aerial combat history. His squadron mates accounted for additional kills, and the Japanese formation had been decimated. When he landed back on USS Essex, his aircraft was riddled with bullet holes, hydraulic fluid streaking the fuselage, and his fuel gauge reading nearly empty. The crew chiefs counted the damage and shook their heads in amazement that he'd made it back. The engagement over Clark Field represented everything the Hellcat had been designed to achieve. It wasn't the most maneuverable fighter in the sky. The Zero still held advantages in certain turning scenarios. It wasn't the fastest several Japanese aircraft could exceed its top speed in specific conditions. What the Hellcat offered was a perfectly balanced weapons platform that allowed well-trained pilots to dominate enemy aviation through superior tactics backed by superior technology. The combination of firepower, protection, speed, and handling characteristics created an aircraft that won fights before they truly began. Japanese commanders reviewing intelligence reports of the engagement faced grim mathematics. If 7 American fighters could destroy dozens of Japanese aircraft while suffering no losses, how could Japan possibly contest American air superiority? The answer, increasingly clear as 1944 drew to a close, was that they couldn't. The F6F Hellcat hadn't just shifted the aerial balance, it had shattered it completely. November 12, 1944 found Lieutenant Saburo Sakai in the operations tent of the 341st Naval Air Group, studying the latest intelligence reports on American carrier operations with the methodical attention that had kept him alive through 3 years of brutal combat. Sakai, Japan's greatest surviving ace with over 60 confirmed kills, had fought against every American fighter from the Buffalo through the Wildcat to the Corsair and the cursed Hellcat. The reports spread across his desk painted a picture that would have seemed impossible in 1942, complete American air dominance across every theater of the Pacific War. The morning briefing brought news that made even veterans like Sakai pause. American carrier groups were now operating with near impunity within range of Japanese-held islands, their Hellcats sweeping aside interceptors with mechanical efficiency. The kill ratio numbers had become absurd 20-1, 30-1 in some engagements. Young pilots were being sent into combat with barely enough training to land safely, let alone fight experienced American aviators flying superior aircraft. Sakai had first encountered the Hellcat over Tarawa in November of 1943. He remembered the engagement with the clarity that trauma burns into memory. His Zero had been performing a routine patrol when 4 Hellcats appeared from the sun. He had immediately recognized them as different from the Wildcats he'd fought before, larger, more solid-looking, radiating mechanical menace. When he attempted his standard tactic of forcing a climbing turn, the lead Hellcat simply accelerated away, climbed above him using its superior power-to-weight ratio, and dove back with guns blazing. Only Sakai's 3 years of combat experience had saved him that day. He had thrown his Zero into a violent spiral, using every gram of his aircraft's maneuverability to evade the stream of 50 caliber rounds reaching toward him. The Hellcat pilot hadn't followed him into the spiral, instead maintaining energy discipline and setting up for another pass. Sakai had escaped by diving to wave-top level and using his knowledge of the local area to lose his pursuer among scattered clouds. He landed at Rabaul with a new understanding. The Americans had not just improved their fighter, they had revolutionized aerial warfare. The transformation Sakai witnessed in American pilot quality troubled him almost as much as the Hellcat's technical superiority. Early in the war, Japanese aviators had held significant advantages in training and experience. But as 1944 progressed, American pilots fresh from training programs were demonstrating competency that rivaled veteran Japanese aviators. The United States had built a training system that mass-produced capable fighter pilots, while Japan's system had broken down under the pressure of constant attrition and resource shortages. Sakai spent hours debriefing young pilots who survived their first encounters with Hellcats, trying to impart lessons that might keep them alive. He taught them to never accept combat on American terms, to disengage from Hellcats whenever possible, to strike only when holding overwhelming advantages of position. But even as he taught these lessons, Sakai knew they were fundamentally defensive, the kind of tactics employed by a force that had lost the initiative and was simply trying to survive. The psychological impact of the Hellcat extended beyond tactical considerations. Sakai watched morale deteriorate throughout his squadron as news of catastrophic losses reached the airfield. Pilots who once flew with confidence now approached missions with fatalistic determination. The appearance of Hellcats on radar scopes triggered calculations about escape routes rather than aggressive intercepts. The spiritual warrior ethos that had animated Japanese naval aviation since its founding was eroding under the weight of constant defeats against an enemy who seemed to possess unlimited resources and improving skill. One evening in late November, Sakai sat with a young pilot named Ensign Katsumi Iwamoto, barely 20 years old with 30 hours of flight time. Iwamoto had been assigned to Sakai's division and would fly his first combat mission the next day. The young man asked the question that haunted every Japanese aviator by late 1944. "Can we win against them, sir? Against the Hellcats and their pilots?" Sakai looked at the young pilot and struggled for an honest answer that wouldn't destroy what little confidence the boy possessed. Finally, he spoke the truth as he understood it. "The Hellcat is a formidable aircraft, but it can be defeated. Our Zero is still more maneuverable, but you must never fight their fight. Use our advantages. Never allow them to dictate the engagement. Stay with your wingman. Never chase a Hellcat that's running, it's almost certainly a trap. And most importantly, survive. The Empire needs experienced pilots more than it needs dead heroes." January 9, 1945, brought leaden skies over Formosa, where the last substantial reserves of Japanese naval aviation were gathering for a desperate attempt to strike American carrier groups. Supporting the invasion of Luzon, Captain Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant aviation tacticians and a principal architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, stood in the command center watching his carefully assembled strike force prepare for launch. He understood with brutal clarity that this represented one of Japan's last opportunities to inflict meaningful damage on the American advance. The strike force represented everything Japan could scrape together over 50 aircraft including Zeros, Judys, and the new Jinga bombers. Genda had handpicked the pilots, selecting the most experienced aviators still available. Many had over 500 combat hours, making them veterans by the standards of late 1944. They understood they were flying into a meat grinder. American combat air patrol over the fleet would consist almost entirely of Hellcats, and the odds were catastrophic. But orders were orders, and Japan's strategic situation had deteriorated beyond the point where rational calculations mattered. The strike launched at dawn, aircraft lifting into gray skies that matched the mood of the pilots. Flight Lieutenant Minoru Suzuki led the escort Zeros, 34 years old and a veteran of campaigns stretching back to China in 1937. He'd fought at Pearl Harbor, Midway, the Solomons, and survived dozens of engagements that had killed better pilots. Now he led men barely old enough to shave into combat against American carrier groups that represented the cutting edge of naval power. The American radar operators detected the incoming raid while it was still 70 miles out. On USS Essex, Air Group 15's ready room exploded into controlled chaos as pilots raced to their aircraft. Lieutenant Alex Vrachu, already an ace with multiple Hellcat kills, climbed into his cockpit with practiced efficiency. All around him, Hellcats were launching into the overcast sky, forming up by divisions before turning toward the threat vector. The interception occurred at 18,000 feet over rough seas whipped by winter winds. Suzuki spotted the American fighters climbing toward his formation and felt his stomach tighten. There were dozens of them, more Hellcats than he'd ever seen in one place, and they were coordinating their attack with precision that spoke to excellent training and battlefield experience. He called out positions to his pilots, knowing even as he did so that the warning would matter little in the chaos to come. The Hellcats struck from multiple vectors simultaneously, executing a coordinated attack that exploited every advantage of their aircraft and tactics. Vrachu led his division into the Japanese bombers while other Hellcat divisions engaged the Zeros. The F6F's superior speed allowed American pilots to slash through the formation, fire devastating bursts, and extend away before Japanese fighters could respond. It was textbook energy fighting against an enemy who had no effective counter-tactics. Suzuki fought his Zero with everything he'd learned in 8 years of combat aviation. He scissored with a Hellcat that overshot his defensive turn, got a brief snapshot that he saw strike the American aircraft's engine cowling, and watched in disbelief as the Hellcat simply absorbed the hits and continued fighting. The F6F's armor protection and self-sealing tanks made it phenomenally survivable. Suzuki's own Zero, built for maneuverability at the expense of protection, would have been crippled by the same hits. Within 15 minutes, the Japanese strike force had been annihilated. Over 40 aircraft destroyed for the loss of 3 Hellcats. Suzuki survived by diving away and running for Formosa at wave-top level, his Zero's engine sputtering from battle damage. Behind him, the sky was filled with smoke trails and debris marking where Japan's carefully hoarded aviation reserve had died. He landed at his base knowing he'd witnessed something beyond tactical defeat. He'd seen the death of Japanese naval aviation as a viable fighting force. Captain Genda received Suzuki's after-action report in silence, reading the devastating casualty figures without visible emotion. The tactical picture was clear. Japan could no longer effectively contest American carrier air power. The Hellcat, combined with superior American pilot training, radar direction, and tactical doctrine, had created an insurmountable advantage. Japan's remaining options had narrowed to desperate measures, the kind that had started being whispered about in planning cells, involving pilots who wouldn't be expected to return. April 7, 1945 dawned over Okinawa with the kind of serene Pacific beauty that made the carnage of war seem obscene. The island had become the crucible of Japan's last organized resistance, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had launched Operation Tengoa suicide mission, sending the super battleship Yamato and its escorts on a one-way trip to Okinawa. The plan was desperate, symbolic, and ultimately futile, but it represented the kind of thinking that now dominated Japanese strategic planning. Lieutenant Commander John Ostrander led his Hellcat squadron from USS Hornet on combat air patrol over the American fleet when the call came through large. Japanese surface force detected heading south. The excitement in the radio operator's voice was palpable. This was what carrier aviation had been designed for since Billy Mitchell sank those battleships in the 1920s. Ostrander checked his fuel gauge, confirmed his wingmen were in position, and turned toward the intercept vector. The Japanese surface force included no carriers, which meant no fighter cover for the ships. This was deliberate. Japan no longer had operational carriers to send, and what few aircraft could be scraped together were being reserved for kamikaze attacks. The Yamato and her escorts steamed toward Okinawa, knowing they would face wave after wave of American aircraft with no air cover. It was a death ride in the most literal sense, undertaken because Japanese military culture had reached a point where symbolic gestures mattered more than strategic reality. The American strike materialized out of the clouds like an avenging angel over 300 aircraft from multiple carrier groups. Hellcats swept ahead of the torpedo bombers and dive bombers, searching for the Japanese fighters that weren't there. When Ostrander realized there was no aerial opposition, he understood immediately what it meant. Japan had been so completely stripped of carrier aviation capability that they couldn't even provide fighter cover for their last battleship's final mission. The Hellcats transitioned from fighter cover to strafing attacks, diving on the Japanese destroyers and screening vessels with their .650 caliber guns. The destroyers' anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with black bursts of flak, but the Hellcats were too fast, too numerous, and attacking from too many angles. Ostrander made 3 passes on a destroyer, watching his tracers tear into the ship's superstructure and seeing secondary explosions blossom along her deck. For the Japanese sailors aboard the Yamato and her escorts, the attack represented a nightmare of American air power operating with complete impunity. The massive battleship's anti-aircraft batteries fired continuously, but they'd been designed to defend against formations of level bombers, not the swirling chaos of dive bombers and torpedo planes coordinated by fighter directors and protected by Hellcats. Wave after wave of American aircraft pressed home their attacks with a precision born from 3 years of carrier aviation evolution. The Yamato absorbed torpedo hit after torpedo hit, her massive hull shuddering under the impacts. Fires raged across her superstructure from bomb hits and strafing attacks. The great ship began listing as flooding overwhelmed her damage control capabilities. At 14:23 hours, she rolled over and exploded, her magazine detonating with a force that was visible from miles away. The symbol of Japanese naval power disappeared beneath the waves, taking most of her crew with her. Ostrander and his wingmen circled the scene, watching Japanese survivors struggling in the oil-covered water. The Hellcats had expended their ammunition, and there was nothing more to do. He formed up his squadron and turned back toward the carrier, thinking about the mission they'd just flown. The Japanese surface force had been destroyed without a single American aircraft lost to enemy fighters, because there were no enemy fighters. The Hellcat had helped destroy Japanese carrier aviation so thoroughly that Japan's last battleship died without air cover. The sinking of the Yamato marked an endpoint. Japan would continue fighting for another 4 months, but organized naval aviation resistance had effectively ceased. The Hellcat had achieved what its designers intended: complete aerial supremacy over the Pacific. The kill ratio by war's end would exceed 19-1, an almost unprecedented figure in military aviation history. 75% of all American naval aerial victories in the Pacific were achieved by Hellcats. August 15, 1945 brought Emperor Hirohito's voice-over radio broadcasts throughout Japan, announcing surrender and ending the Pacific War. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, having survived the entire conflict, stood in the ruins of what had been his squadron's ready room and contemplated what the war had taught him. The Hellcat figured prominently in those lessons, not just as an aircraft, but as a symbol of American industrial power, tactical evolution, and the kind of systematic excellence that had overwhelmed Japan's warrior spirit with cold efficiency. The statistics told a story that Japanese naval aviation officers would study for generations. The F6F Hellcat had destroyed over 5,000 enemy aircraft in air.